with the massive success of board games like Evolution and Cytosis, teaching fundamental concepts while still being beautiful, challenging, full-scale epics, the board gaming industry is currently concocting extraordinary science-based games. I'm Celeste De Angelis, the host of Which Game First, a board game podcast, here with our own scientist and skeptical panelists, as well as science board game design experts from the industry. Let's just start. While we talk about this exciting topic, let's go around the virtual table. We'll start with John to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm John Coveyou from Genius Games. I've been running Genius Games for about 7 or 8 years now. I was an engineer before that, and I thought to myself, you know what? I don't like the corporate world, so why don't I try and make some science games, right? What a novel concept at that point. Right. And today, it's doing pretty well. Last year, we actually acquired another company, Artana Games. So now we actually have 2 different companies underneath our umbrella. Artana is famous for games like Tessa vs. Edison, Lovelace and Babbage, and a new release that is just coming out this month on the origin of species. And under Genius Games, we're known for hard science-based games like Cytosis, Subatomic, Periodic, and some of our older games. So yeah, that's about me.
Thanks for being here. And Dominic?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dominic Crapuchettes, and I founded North Star Games in 2003, so about 17 years ago, and we do a whole bunch of games. So we don't focus just on science. We do party games, hobby games, family games, and kind of stumbled into the science side by playing a game that a Russian biologist had put out on evolution, and it just brought the whole ecosystem to life, and I fell for the theme and wanted to revamp the game without losing the science part.
Well, thank you for being here today. And Evan?
Evan Bernstein. I'm one of the co-hosts of Which Game First, a board game podcast, along with Celeste and Ed here. I'm also the co-host of another podcast called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, which is a weekly science podcast, and I've been on that program since 2005. So I'm a bit of a veteran when it comes to the podcast game. As far as my background in games itself, I've been part of companies that have run live-action role-playing games. I've also been part of a company that has designed tabletop games for D20 rule systems. And also, sort of as a hobby of mine, I've written a few murder mystery adventures that you can play along with in your house. Nothing that it was ever published, but it got some rave reviews from my friends and from my biased friends and family who participated in those with me. So that's my background.
And Ed.
Hi, I'm Ed Povilaitis. I am a panelist on Which Game First. I am a longtime gamer. I've also done game design at Angry.Games, and I'm a chemist in my day job, so I design drugs. Yay!
Yeah, hard science. Love it.
Well, let's get right into it. I wanted to ask a little icebreaker question first. The theme of science has been around a long time in board games. I wanted to ask each of you, what was the first science board game that you played that sort of got you interested? Let me start with one of our guys. Evan, what was the first one you played?
Well, that's a good question, Celeste, and I had to, jog my memory quite a bit for that one. Going back to, when I'm 7 and 8 years old, playing board games on the floor with my sisters or my next door neighbors and stuff. And perhaps the two that came to mind, speaking of mind, we would play a game called Concentration. And, there are lots of variations on the game Concentration, or it's that game concept is incorporated into a lot of games. It's a memory game, in which you expose either cards or tiles or something, and then you have to turn them back over, and you have to use your brain to really kind of focus and remember patterns and what was where. But the other game that stuck out to me was perhaps Operation. Can you call that a science game? I think you can. I think that technically counts, although not we aren't exactly reaching in and grabbing people's funny bones and pulling them out, and there are technical names for things like funny bones, but there was some hand-eye coordination going on there. There was a bit of anatomy to be learned through the Operation game, and certainly the sensation of making the mistake of taking the metal tweezers and touching them to the metal telltale sides of the holes was, shocking both physically and, just in excitement. So I'd say that would be my first experience.
And John, how about you?
Yeah, the first game I played that was accurately or designed around a science concept would probably have to be Compounded by Dice Hate Me Games, or now Greater Than Games. I was really fascinated by it. And it actually, when I saw that on Kickstarter, I don't remember when that was. I think it might have been 2013 or 2014. Seeing that game on Kickstarter and how well it did, there you go, Ed. Yeah,
there it is.
He's got
right
all the
there.
examples right behind him. Perfect. It was a huge inspiration for me. I thought, wow, people actually want something like this. But clearly that wasn't around when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I mainly played your mass market classic games, right? The Monopoly, Stratego, Risk, and I would say the closest thing, and this is really a stretch, the closest thing would be Clue, because of all the deduction that's in that game, and I think
it's forensic, right?
Yeah, it is. And I think it's really cleverly done for the time period that it was designed in. And now we have things that are a lot more elegant than that, and we would consider that very primitive in design. But for its time, I think it was really clever for a kid like me to be playing something like that, and the deduction skills you got to practice. It was great. Yeah.
Yeah. And Dominic, how about you?
Yeah, I had a hard time thinking about this too. As a kid, we played a lot of games because my family didn't watch television, so we played three nights a week. We played board games. I don't think anything really I would classify as science-based. Yeah. So I'd say my first science-based game, and this is a stretch too. They've all been a stretch. Would be Advanced Civilization. I played in high school. And there was, my mind was sparked by, it's kind of a historical look at the progression of science. But that definitely got me excited.
And Ed, how about you?
A couple of ones I can think about. Evan already hit on Operation, kind of like removing your butterfly from your stomach. Not really science, but there's a little bit there. And I think another one from my childhood I can think of that touches on some aspects of science is Mastermind, where you're trying to decipher the code. It teaches a little bit of logic in a way.
Yeah.
And I think after that, maybe Robo Rally for like a little programming.
Oh, wow.
And again, more sequencing and stuff like that, but it's a little sciencey.
I'd say that's science. Yeah, I would agree.
So I think it's safe to say the theme has come a long way.
Yes.
And in designing today, for our first broader question, which is it's multi-level, so I'm just going to ask the whole thing. It's a series of questions. When designing a science-themed board game, what are the challenges? How do you get the ball rolling? Do you allow the process to unfold and adapt to the results like science works? Or do you do it in a less scientific approach where you have an outcome in mind and sort of try to design a system around that? Let me start with John. What do you think?
Sure. So we take a very interesting approach in that we actually start with a science concept in mind. We will take that concept and basically create a simulation using components. So we take a science concept, we basically ask the question, what are the most important, the most fundamental things you need to know about this concept? And I'll use cytosis as an example because it's right there behind Edward's head. So it's a good example. That game takes place inside of a human cell. So we ask the question, if you were to take a look at a human cell, what are the most basic but also most fundamental things you need to know to understand the functioning of a human cell? And then we built a little mini simulation out of that. And I've actually got a video on YouTube that I explain sort of the whole process when we first launched the Kickstarter campaign of my thought process and some of the notes I had and some of the diagrams and things like that. And then once we have those resources out there that are mimicking each of the, say, a protein or a DNA or RNA or lipids or carbohydrates and each of the different organelles in a cell, we ask, what is this cell trying to achieve, and how can we basically incentivize players to move towards that, and then put barriers in their way or give them only parts of what they need and other players other parts. So you start to see this competition. And the really interesting thing about the way that we go about it, starting with the simulation, is our first few plays of what we're making are usually not even a game at all. I mean, it's just embarrassing how bad it is at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
But once we identify where the fun is and something that could be interesting, at that point we try and apply traditional game mechanisms. Like with Cytosis, we weren't sure, we didn't start off thinking this is going to be a worker placement game. We started off thinking this is going to be a game about cell biology. And then when we had all the resources out there and we had the simulation in place, we were trying to think of what kind of traditional mechanisms will best allow players decisions to get resources of a certain type versus another type. And we thought, we tried a few different things out, and action selection. I think we even tried card drafting and a few other things, but worker placement was the cleanest way to do it. Now, one of the challenges that came out of that was we then started asking ourselves, well, what are we in this game? Because a player being able to sort of buy into the theme as an agent in that story is really, really important. And it's something that we have always struggled with our games, because it's like, well, you're inside of a cell and you're placing flasks to collect resources. That's not accurate at all. And I don't want to jump ahead to things we're probably going to talk about. How do you deal with those kinds of things? But we at some point we started to decide what liberties are we willing to take for the sake of getting the science right. So that's how we start. And after that, it's just play testing. And I've got my own philosophies on that and how to walk through the development process. But that's how we basically start off. It's more of a simulation that we try and turn a game into, rather than starting with a game and trying to figure out how do we make the science work in that.
How long does that playtest process take you usually?
That's a great question. Cytosis took from the initial idea to the time we actually had a prototype on the table, I want to say, it was at least 6 months to 9 months just to get a good working prototype on the table. And then it was another 6 to 9 months probably before we had like a decent game that we felt like, okay, we have something here. It's close enough to where we need it to be that we can start talking seriously about publishing this game and getting artwork for it and getting, putting some money out to really finalize this thing. But another example, a game called Genotype, which was on Kickstarter earlier this year, that should be releasing later this year. It's a game about Mendelian genetics. I started designing, that was one of the second games I started making about 6 or 7 years ago. And it just, it was a huge struggle to get through a lot of the science in that game. And we can talk more details about why it was so difficult. But we ended up putting that game on the shelf probably 3 times and pulling it back out. Then I paid a developer, Ian Zhang. I basically said, hey, if you can resurrect this prototype, because it's on my shelf right now, we'll give you, we'll pay you a royalty on it and give you development credit on it. And he ended up having such a significant impact on the design of the game that we made him one of the designers of the game, because there were so many novel things that he added in. And that was almost a 7-year process, right? Wow. So it really does depend. A few of the games we made, they just fell into place. Within a month, it's just, you're like, wow, this is it. And then others, you just struggled through it for years. And it's hard to predict, which way it'll go. I kind of have some ideas about why it went one way versus the other. But yeah, it's usually hard to predict early on. At some point, it just sort of starts working. And other times it really struggles for a while.
Are you, do you experience similar things, Dominic? Some work, some don't. What are the challenges you've run into when you're trying to get the ball rolling on a game design?
So I approach things differently than John. John started a science-based company. We do board games that are science-based games. I started a board game company because I've loved board games and designed them my whole life. I thought I was going to go into academia for a long time. So I have a love of academia. So for me, the most important thing is the game. And so one of the things that John said he struggled with, I can identify with, which is who am I in this game? And that's been a real issue for the Evolution series, because people want to be a species or a person. They want to really have something they identify with it. And that game really hits its stride when you realize you're a scientist observing this dynamic ecosystem that's changing, and you're watching all these species adapt. And the act of adapting changes the ecosystem because they are part of the ecosystem. And so there's this continually shifting ecosystem based upon the adaptations that the species are making. So that's an issue, I think. It's an issue that you're supposed to say, who am I? Oh, you're a scientist that's fascinated with this ecosystem. But if you don't make that step, then sometimes you have a hard time enjoying the theme of the game.
Yeah.
Right.
So then for me, it's mostly about who's the audience and how many rules are they willing to learn? Because, board games really are not the best way to teach really deep and complicated subjects, because you need, so what you're trying to do is go, what is a theme that people can latch onto, and what's the broad stroke that I can make that really captures the essence of what's going on, so that it's easy to explain and everyone kind of latches on to the theme.
Yep. So conceptually speaking, you sort of have that tightrope to walk of entertainment, right? That blends with a theme that is very thick, a very rich theme. So that's interesting. How important is it? I know that John was saying the getting the facts right, the scientific facts were huge for him. It took him 6 or 7 years where you actually had to shelve a game because of that. So how important is that to you overall? And I'm going to start with Dominic on this one. Are you designing games that must adhere to the rules that science follows? And how much latitude do you allow yourself to stray from the purity of the science?
So this is kind of a belief, but I believe that knowledge is infinite, that the world, we will continually keep learning more and more details about how things work. So at some point you just have to accept that this is incomplete model that's trying to model reality.
Sure.
Yeah.
For me, the most important thing is the game has to be good and engaging. And then I try to pack in as much science as possible. And I think for me, one of the things that I really love, and this is just particular, really the only science-based game I've done is these evolution games. One of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about is why is this trait useful to a species in an ecosystem? And I keep trying to model it as simply as possible. And so we let go of a lot of ancillary things. We really want to say, what is the main thing that this one adaptation does? And I feel like we know we hit it on the head when, one, you can communicate it quickly and it works with the theme. And then two, and this is one of my favorite things, when you create a trait like burrowing, that just works. And it keeps you cooler during hot temperatures. It keeps you warmer in cold temperatures. It allows you to hide from predators when you don't have to go out and get food. And so we've modeled that in the game. And then we also have a trait called hibernation. And it models hibernation. And in real life, these two traits happen together a lot because hibernating and burrowing just work well together. And so I really feel like we just hit our stride well when in the game, though, that combo is a really good combo because individually those things really are mimicking something that takes place in real ecosystems.
Yeah, I can say that because we did play the game, we reviewed the game. And for those of us who do sort of have a good understanding of how generally science works and some basic concepts about science, on those specific topics you were talking about, Dominic, burrowing and hibernation, that came through loud and clear. No doubt about it. It was right there for you, and like, yes, this is right. This makes sense. And again, to those who are either scientifically trained, even just a little bit, and can recognize that, it popped. It most certainly did pop. And that's actually something that's true of all these games that we have talked about and are going to be talking about. For those of us who know, we know when it works and we can recognize it, and it just stands out like a sore thumb, but in a very good way.
Yes, the pare down aspect of it. John, before I ask Ed, because I want to see how he thinks they work, but I'd like to get your take, John, on the paring down. How much paring down do you run into when you're designing these games? Do you feel like you're leaving a lot off the table?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything Dominic said. He really hit the nail on the head there. It's when you're creating a game like this, and I talked about the simulation, which is sort of a buzzword in the science community. A simulation is a simplified model of something that is very detailed and complicated. And the simulation is supposed to identify the most fundamental elements of whatever it's trying to simulate. And so, yeah, there's with cytosis or even periodic as an example, what we want to do is basically create a basic framework for that science concept that's as accurate as we can possibly make it. But the details you can drape over the skeleton, right? You can work with this framework. You can drape the details over the framework. We're not going to go into the details in the gameplay, but the infrastructure of what we're doing in the game is accurate enough that all the details will be understandable from that framework. And there is, I think every design, there is a compromise between the level of detail and the level of science accuracy and the liberties you take for the game's sake. Because, if a game is purely an accurate simulation and nothing more, well, no one's going to buy that. Well, maybe some people will buy it, and I won't judge them.
Yeah, you'll limit your market, though.
You'll limit your market, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And if the game is just really, really fun, but not accurate to the science as that's fine. And there's a lot of games like that, and they're really fun to play. But from my perspective, I want players to come away with something really constructive about the ideas they were just engaging with. Mm-hmm. And so I love playing games like that, but it's not the type of game that my company wants to produce. And so we are always having a conversation about how much is too much detail, what kind of details, what kind of science concepts can we take some liberties on without really frustrating people who understand this at a really core level and a really complicated level. And also, are we getting those basics right without taking too many liberties? So, the last thing we want to do is completely misinform. There's a difference between taking a liberty and simplifying and totally misinforming. And we don't want to misinform, but we're definitely open to, oversimplifying. And one of the other things we've done to get around this, and it was a suggestion by our customer base, is now with almost every game that we produce, we include, along with the rule book, we include a separate document that's a science behind. Mm-hmm. So the science behind cytosis is as an example. Mm-hmm. And this document is crowdsourced. We don't write it internally. It's crowdsourced by our customer base. And cytosis, as an example, if you look at the back of that manual, there's 20 to 30 doctors and PhDs across the globe that actually wrote out each of the descriptions in that manual. They played the game. They looked at what the game is trying to mimic. They explained the science, and then they explained how the game is trying to mimic that and what liberties we might have taken or how it really happens in life or in the cell. And so that's another, that document actually, because of how accurate and how robust it is, it allows us to take a little bit more liberties in the game itself. Because we're going to tell people along with those liberties, here's how the science really works, and here's how we actually got it wrong in the game, so we can make a fun game that you're actually going to like to play, right? And you kind of have to have that balance.
Right, right. It's almost like a historical footnote that it comes at the bottom of a fictional account.
Right, right.
I'll tell you with cytosis, and this kind of goes into our next question about education. I'm not a scientist, but I loved physics in both high school and the college courses I took, but I hated chemistry.
Yeah.
And I hated biology. So I played cytosis, with the guys, and Ed brought it to the table. And I was fascinated that a cell did so much. I had no idea. And especially alcohol detoxification and how many resources it took up. And I was immediately inspired to go and look up more about the cell and to look through that document that you included in it. So it does hit that inspirational point. Same thing with oceans. Absolutely love the evolutionary aspect of it. And it just reminded me of all those things I had learned in high school and how much I had wished it was more like this. It was more fun.
Yeah, there was a game we also reviewed called Conspiracy Theories, if you guys remember, and they were cards, and they talked about, myths and lores and legends and conspiracy theories. But also on the cards, there was a QR code, which brought you to a website, which went into further explanation and the background and the history of how, the conspiracy theory itself. So that
website is controlled by aliens. I don't know.
Oh, it is. Yeah, I know that it's all part of a master, bigger plan that we can't see. The concept, though, of education and learning beyond the game, certainly that is a feature I'm seeing more and more in not just science-based games, but other games that have these sort of reality components. Learn more, go here. Learn more, read this. So, and that's a real nice touch in games as far as I'm concerned.
Now, Ed, go ahead, John.
Well, this is Dominic. I wanted to
Dominic.
backtrack to how important is it to get the science right. And I wanted to bring out one time when we purposefully got it wrong.
Purposefully
got it wrong.
Okay.
So there's a trait in evolution called climbing. And really, you don't evolve a trait called climbing. You might get claws that help with climbing. You might have opposable thumbs. You might have a tail. There are a lot of things that you can do. But really when we kind of called it all these more sciencey names, the theme got lost. Because really what we're looking at is the ecosystem and the impact to an ecosystem. And when someone can climb, they can get away from predators, and their only predator becomes other species that can climb. So that was really kind of how we, so that's where we purposefully get the theme, the science wrong, because we think it communicates the theme and the gameplay better.
Interesting.
Ed, how do you think the mechanics flow with these newer games, the like Cytosis and Evolution and Oceans? How do they flow well with the concepts that they're teaching as a sort of a gamer and a scientist? What's your thinking there?
I mean, I've seen a variety of games. Some of them are really lightly mechanic and lightly themed, and they're fine for getting the concept correct. And then I played other games that are more deeper simulations, and they really get into the math behind it. And I love extra details, so great for me. But there's some people who don't really want to know the math. They don't care to know the math behind it. So it's kind of interesting to see there is a market there where some people will be accessible to, familiar mechanics that have the ability to teach a theme, and other people who, sort of heavier gamers can spend a little extra time going a little deeper and heavier mechanics as well. I think another interesting thing that some of these games bring out is just how the game plays can teach you something. Let's take evolution, for example. We're all making our animals and feeding the ground, and all of a sudden, that first carnivore shows up. And the species start to get nervous. And then it's not a mechanic per se. It's how your ecosystem has changed, and that drives gameplay, I think. And it's a very interesting thing to see this, the environment made evolution in the wild. Like, ooh, that thing gonna eat me. I better get defensive. I better learn how to climb trees and get out of the way.
A real impact on how the players are going to play out their game. That is an interesting connection.
Right. Well, when you're trying to entertain first and educate second, or at least just as a natural side effect, have some illuminating elements of the game, educating through these science games, how important a factor is that to you guys while you're designing? I know we touched on it, but is it always a secondary purpose, or is it sometimes the primary? And I know you guys, Dominic and John, will come at this from different angles. So let's start with John. Is it more of an after effect where the fun and enjoyment comes first? What's the balance, the blend there? Can you get more detail?
Yeah, so this is almost a philosophical question for me. It's a very deep, very important question. I don't think that you can come away from playing a game and have an experience that we wouldn't consider in some way educational, right? So I would say that first and foremost. And my passion as a human on this earth is to make people better by interacting with them. And one of the things that I think is extremely important is science literacy. And so at the end of the day, I want our general population to be more science literate than we currently are. And I think that will help to positively influence lots of the issues that our society faces, right? I don't need to say much more than that about my beliefs and my philosophy behind it, my motivation and passion behind it. But the thing that will surprise you is that we don't make our games to educate first. Our primary audience, our target customer, is actually a gamer who is also a scientist. That is the person that we design for. The reason why we design for that individual is because we want the gamer to come away having a joyful experience, having an experience where they say, wow, that was a good game. I would play that again. And we want the scientist to say, wow, that was clever how accurate the science was integrated into the mechanisms, right? So that's how we approach each game. Now, as a consequence of each game being accurately designed around a science concept, educators have adopted them and are now using them in their classrooms, or using them for virtual schooling and homeschooling and things like that, using them to reinforce concepts. And that just makes me unbelievably happy, because that's a huge passion of mine. When I first started the company, the main motivation I had was I'm sitting around with some of my friends. We play a lot of board games, and a lot of my friends are into science, and we say, you know what? Why is there not more games about just hard science concepts? There's a few of them that are out there, but yeah, they weren't as good as we would have liked them to be. So I took a shot at it, and that was really the main motivation. So to summarize, I could just go on and on and on about this topic, clearly. To summarize, I think it actually is a huge advantage for us to not focus on making the games educational. And that term educational it's a very bad word in gaming, right? There's a lot of baggage from educational games that were just really bad to make money, to in some ways just to scam parents into saying your kids are going to learn something, even though they're really not, right?
Good point.
And so
That's a good point.
We stay away from that kind of language, and we focus on quality games for gamers that are as scientifically accurate as possible. And then as a consequence, educators will pick them up and use them in the classroom. And that's what really gets me going. And that allows us to make the best game possible. And I think it's, primarily why we've been so successful as a company, and why our games have had such a long tail, even years and years after they've published. So, yeah.
And it makes me think that maybe my introduction shouldn't have said that teach fundamental concepts so much as that happen to teach fundamental concepts. Dominic, how about you? The same question.
So how important? The science in evolution was extremely important to me. So there are a ton of card combo games out there with a theme of magic. And so it's so easy to just say, oh yeah, it's magic. That's why it works this way. And I really did not want evolution to fall into that trap. I didn't want it to be a collection of mechanics So I would say I created 20 traits that were mechanically clean, that worked well, that were simple to communicate, but that didn't have like the theme. And so I threw them out. And so designing Evolution took several years longer than it could have taken, because the science was really important to me. At the same time, the game was really important. I mean, I never, if I had to choose between the two, the game has to be fun. But the development took a lot longer because the science was so important. And then when we approach an expansion, we go through the same thing. I tried to outsource development to an employee, and it just didn't work, because to him, an expansion was a set of mechanics. And I did not want Evolution to be that. And so when we approached flight, we said, what impact does flight have on an ecosystem? And what does it allow a species to do? And so all of the designing and so then when we did climate, the same thing. How does heat impact species? That are bigger. Like, really, there's like a surface area to mass ratio that really explains whether they can dissipate heat. And dissipating heat is great in the heat, and it's bad in the cold. And so we found, like, what is the core concept about climate that we want to simulate. And so the Evolution games are, the science to me is extremely important. One of the consequences of that, and John has alluded to this, is a lot of gamers go, oh, that looks like a science-based game. And so even the water
about that. How do you combat that?
Yeah, and so with Oceans, I gave myself a little more liberty to try to combat that, and we can maybe talk about that at a little bit later time.
Did it? When you think about that, though, just to touch on it briefly, the idea of because both of you touched on the idea of combating this negative stigma around education in games. And, Evan comes at this a lot himself from the skeptical standpoint, and sort of faces that sort of rejection of concepts like, I might learn something, but then, mostly we want to learn something. We just don't realize it at the moment, and to combine the two can sometimes be a shaky balance. To touch on that, though, do you find that the art that you guys use is, I noticed in Oceans, I was very captivated by that. Is that one of the combative techniques? John, how about you? I know Dominic. I know for you, Dominic. You start, Dominic, because I took the question from you. So the art, talk to me about it.
Yeah, the art, I think, is extremely important. I mean, it's extremely important to bring out the science, and it's extremely important in non-science games. I mean, Cool Mini or not, wants to have beautiful art, because that's the first thing that draws you in and makes you want to love the game. So yeah, the art's, I mean, there's really not much more to say. It's very important.
John, do you find that as well, that it's an important draw to captivate?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, especially the box cover, right? If you can't get them to take a second look at the box cover or pick it up, or stop scrolling when they're online and they see it, then you're dead in the water. So art's huge for us, and we have we've been getting better and better at how we portray science concepts in a way that's enticing. A lot of people, when you see something that looks scientific, you have flashbacks to biology textbooks in high school and middle school, and
right. There's an intimidation factor.
There definitely is. And so we have been trying to find ways. I think we really excelled with that in our most recent game, Genotype. It's a beautiful game that actually takes place on Mendel's monastery. And so you get this almost this mid-century theme to it, where it's old burnt paper and and the fauna that's around, and so it takes a different approach, and I think it makes it a lot more beautiful and compelling. Whereas something like with cytosis, you look at that box and you're like, that's a cell. I either want to play that game now or I want to run. There's not a lot in the middle.
I think it even goes farther than that. When I played Cytosis, the actual, and I think about and talk about art a lot on the podcast. I address that topic first on a lot of my reviews. The smooth edges, psychologically, just the curving and the bubbling of the cell itself and what you did in the drawings there, the choice that you made to make it an actual smooth thing helped me. It helped me be more interested because, again, I came from an aspect of, oh my goodness, a cell. I really struggled with that, C+ at best in high school. I wanted to play that. I was interested. I was like, okay, this cell isn't going to hurt me. It's nice. It's cute. It's round. It's big. It's bubbly. It's okay. And that was huge for me. I know, Ed, you are always fascinated by the components and the pieces that come with it, the other elements of the game. How does that affect science games? What's interesting to you about the artistic and component elements there?
Well, I mean, being able to see the picture of the art brings you in, but being able to manipulate stuff is kind of the game. So being able to play the card, being able to move the cubes, it brings you into what the game is doing and what the activities, the science behind the game. So being able, this is the enzyme I'm putting together over here and moving it through the cell. It's like, now I got a protein. Yay! It's like being able to manipulate and touch it makes it real.
I wanted to ask you guys a little bit about a couple of things. You've been designing games a long time now, right? Science games a long time. What have you come down to any tricks or techniques that are tried and true for you? Anything that you go to first or that really helps you with the process? It's kind of an abstract, but John?
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to the simplifying the science down and creating a simulation as my main trick. We get a lot of submissions, and a lot of people say, I made this science game. I want you guys to take a look at it. And what we realize after playing the game a few rounds, and this happens, probably 95% of the time when we get pitches with science games, is you can tell it's a take on the mechanisms are a take on a game that currently exists that they thought, hey, maybe the science could fit into this. And you can tell because the science is really clunky and feels kind of crammed in. And that's precisely why we do it the exact opposite way, where we say, here's the science. What are the most important parts? What's a simplified simulation of this? And now how can we turn this into some traditional mechanisms that make sense. And I actually wrote a 2-part article for Game Trade Magazine about this process and why we do it that way. It's basically just theme first designing, right? If you had a game about a mafia family as an example, and you had the uncle that everyone was afraid of because he had a lot of skeletons in the closet, you could imagine a ton of different mechanisms, like, I'm going to put cubes on his face as the thing that allows me to gain a goodwill with him. It's kind of like, sure, you can do that, but it doesn't make you feel at all like the feeling that's going to happen as if it was, say, a deck of cards and you have no idea when he's going to come out. But when he comes out, it's going to be bad. And so you flip one, you're like, okay, he didn't show up yet. And you're going to flip some more cards. And just through that little difference in mechanism, you already feel the different sense of what it's like to be a part of this mafia family versus just placing some cubes on a board that don't really matter. I think that's really, really important with what we're doing. Is starting first with that simulation. So you've got to feel right and then fitting the mechanisms to make the game feel like what it's supposed to. So theme first designing, it's kind of, what I'm talking about. And then maybe the other trick, it's not really a trick, but it's just playtest until you're just blue in the face. Yep. We get so many submissions and we'll read the rule book, we'll play through a couple times and we're like, man, did they even play test this thing? This is
That's
going on here.
gosh.
So we once we have a concept that we feel like is working, we will just get so much feedback. And as a designer, you just have to be humble. You have to be humble and you have to listen. If you want that game to be as good as it can be, then you have to be as humble as you can while listening to feedback. And if you care more about just looking good because you want the game to be successful, I hate to break it to you, but that's going to be your own hurdle. And you're not going to get, if you're not willing to listen to feedback because you want the game to look good, because you want it to look good on yourself, that is going to be your own destruction. And that game's not going to get much better if you're not actively listening and actively looking for feedback and being humble when applying things that you're hearing are not working well.
For folks watching this is how science works, by the way, is that there's a lot of humility. You have to be very humble. You have to be, criticism is so critical to the scientific process. In the game design process, what you're pointing out, John, is exactly the same thing. And what you get is something truer in the end, something that's better, something that's more appreciated by more people and will enjoy the product in the end as a result. It's a real smart way of doing it.
And has been vetted along the way.
Sure.
Yep. It's important to get as many perspectives as possible because, let's face it, you're one person, or even if you got a team of designers, you're those people, and a game hopefully going to go out to thousands. So, and in order to get a touch of that, you got to get a sampling of what the audience thinks. Somebody who actually hasn't even been working on the game is like, here, take a look at this. I'm not going to tell you anything. Can you figure out what it's about?
Yeah.
Yeah, and as reviewers, that's the first thing that sticks out to us. And as game players, they're going to smell it if it's just a skin. If it doesn't, if the theme does not heavily inform the play, it's the first thing that comes out, and it makes the game often too dull to even play because it just doesn't fit right.
I know that's been your critique once or twice, Celeste, in our couple of years of doing this. Yes. Oh yeah.
Dominic, techniques, tricks, anything that really works for you?
Well, I liked what John had to say. Theme first, definitely. The mechanics are tools that you use to bring out a theme. And even more than the theme, really, like, what's the feeling that, John was talking about this too, the feeling that the players have. And so with a science-based game, you're not really, I think the reason people run from science-based games is an old model was, I'm going to cram a bunch of facts down your throat. Memorize these facts. And really, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying
a quiz later on that. Yeah.
Yeah, a pop quiz.
Yeah.
And what we want to do is have some science-based concept that we are illustrating. And so so we want to invoke a sense of wonder that you're like, wow, look at how this works, which is the wonder that scientists have when they're trying to understand the world around them. Yeah. And then on the playtesting side that John said, we do tons and tons of playtesting, and there's really two sets of audiences that we're looking for. One is how easy is this to teach? So we want to get the simplest rules that capture the theme, and then two, how much replay value does it have? And the replay value we're really good at assessing because we play it hundreds of times in the office, but we have to go outside to see, like, that's not intuitive, because a lot of rules we will create to solve a problem, and we kind of we've had that problem for like 5 games, and so we're like, oh, the solution, great, this works, and then it's just not an elegant solution. And so when you're trying to teach it, there's like an exception that has an exception to it. And you're like, okay, we can't have an exception with an exception. That just has to go.
Well, I thank you guys for being here. And before we go, I just want to ask one final question, which is the question we get asked most at the end of any of our live panels. And that is, hey, what other games in this genre or whatever topic you're talking about, in this case, science-based games, can we play with my friends? What can I play with my friends that's along these lines? Give me more. So let me start with John. What do you have, John, that you want to really get out there? Say, what do you want to recommend?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to stroke Dominic's ego too much, but I was going to say evolution for sure. Wingspan also I really, really love.
We did too.
Compounded is a game that I had a incredible experience with in one of the first science games that I played. So those are definitely the three that I would recommend.
And Dominic?
I don't have a good answer for this, really. On the board game side, because it hasn't been a focus of mine. I've played more video games that bring out some science concepts that I love.
Hit us with it.
Well, like Civilization, I think, was the first one. It literally came with a book that was like 120 pages, and I read every single page, and it was talking about like the impact that iron had over bronze, and then how they smelted it, and like just understanding the progression of human history, to me, was just fascinating. And then a game bringing that to light. It's definitely been one of the inspirations for me. I hear a lot about Phil Eklund, but I haven't played many of his games, and I think he approaches it a little more from the science side and a little less from the gameplay side. So it's not
Phil Eklund.
probably Phil Eklund.
Evan, how about you?
Well, couple games maybe that we'll touch on. Sign of the Times, maybe. Pandemic. Again, one of those games, that maybe was for some people out there their first touch of a science-based game, in which it's your job, you and your team's job to contain the pandemic and prevent the global catastrophe that's going on. And what that game does is it really showcases just how quickly and out of control these things can get with just a little bit. You start putting your resources over here. Okay, you're good here, but be careful over there, because that's gonna spread like wildfire, and these things do spread like wildfire. So it's very topical right now, pandemic. And I also want to give a tip of the hat to Terraforming Mars. Now, it's not. I wouldn't call it a hard science game, but it brings up some real interesting science concepts and some things that are actually being talked about in science circles right now. For example, there's one card that you can play. I mean, it's a huge game. It's a big game with a lot of aspects, but there's one particular thing. You can play a card in which which you can activate basically a tractor beam that will drag an asteroid or some foreign body closer to the surface, either crashing it into the surface or putting it in orbit to help control the climate of Mars. And believe it or not, scientists are actually looking into that as possible ways. How do we capture asteroids to mine them for their minerals and other things that they may have that can be of benefit to us on the planet? Or could we, eventually crash something into Mars to make it a little more habitable for humans for future human exploration? So it touches on some of those concepts, and it definitely deserves to be mentioned.
Yeah.
Ed? I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
I was going to say, on top of that, Terraforming Mars, I kind of forgot about it. The way the atmospheric disposition of gases plays into the temperature and how they're building vegetation, it's quite accurate to how you would terraform a planet like that. So I would definitely tip my hat to that game as well. It's got some very interesting things happening in it.
I agree. Terraforming Mars is a very scientific game, I think. There's a lot of different cards. I mean, there are cards you can only play when it's cold, and there are cards you can only play when it's warm, and it's kind of neat. I think we touched upon a lot of ones I would mention. A couple ones, Dominant Species is another one from GMP Games, is pretty good. Space Corp is kind of like a somewhat more accessible space exploration game. And Dominic has mentioned, I played a lot of Phil Eklund's games from Sarah Made Games. So High Frontier, it's very deep into the math of, a couple of my friends know they're smart, they don't enjoy that game. But I have a couple of friends who really enjoy that game, and it is a very highly detailed game about space exploration. I find it, if you like Kerbal Space Program, this is, you're going to learn a lot of rocket science here. And also on the other side, the Bio Trilogy, Genesis, Metaphor, and Origin, they would also take a very scientific look at the origin of the species and stuff. So it's, I think you get a lot of science out of those games as well. And again, a deep dive for heavy gamers. Yeah.
Well, thank you for those recommendations. And thank you, Dominic Crapuchettes and John Coveyou, for joining us today. Thanks again so much. It was a great conversation. Again, we are Which Game First, a board game podcast, weekly releases. Thank you for listening to our panel.